There is a problematic of classical philosophy. In other words, there are certain driving questions that Plato and Aristotle asked. Not just Plato and Aristotle. There are pre-Socratics, and then there are plenty of figures that are contemporaries of theirs too, that come up with some different ideas. But basically, the kinds of ideas and questions that are posed by Plato and Aristotle become the foundation for the rest of philosophy following after them. It's been said that the history of philosophy is basically just a series of footnotes to Plato. And it's a clever phrase, and to some extent it's true, in that he really did set the groundwork for everything that comes afterward. But there is a major shift from the questions Plato asks and then the questions that someone like Descartes asks in the modern world. So when we're looking at someone like Plato and we're going all the way ahead through the Christian Middle Ages into someone like Thomas Aquinas, obviously, there are differences between the development of medieval Christian philosophy and what you have in ancient Greek philosophy. So they have different ideas about God and a number of different things. But a lot of the same basic questions, terms, categories are all still there. So let's talk about the basic problematic of classical philosophy, the basic questions that guide classical philosophy. And then we're going to shift into Descartes and see how the questions that drive philosophy have shifted significantly. So here's the basic problematic of classical philosophy. We have the first question, which is a question that Plato, Aristotle, and the pre-Socratics before them asked, which is, how do the one and the many relate? Why is it that in the world we talk about both unity and diversity? What is it that kind of ties the objects of the world together despite their differences? And just to give one example, if you have, for example, a pet dog. That is an individual dog, right? You identify that as, Fido or whatever the name of your dog is. And I don't know if anybody actually names their dog Fido. It's kind of the stereotypical name, but so you have your dog Fido. That is the one individual dog that you know. However, it's also part of a broader class. The class is dog. You recognize that there's something about that dog that unites it to the other dogs. So even though they're individual dogs with their individual names, you're still placing them all within the same kind of universal category of dog. In fact, there's something so universal about the category of dog that even if every dog that exists today, in terms of all the particular dogs that make up the category of dog today, even if all of them die, which, with the lifespan of dogs in 20 years, they won't exist anymore. However, so even though the individuals are all gone, however, the universal still remains the same, as in the concept of dog is still a real thing. Dog still exists in the form of individual dogs. So those are the kinds of questions that classical philosophers are going to be asking, and they answer this by talking about the difference between forms and essences. And Plato has this notion of the ideal realm of forms. He's an idealist. You see him in the painting with his finger up here, if you're looking at the slideshow. And he believes that the ultimate reality that unifies things is these eternal ideas. Aristotle has his hand down toward the earth because he sees those universals as existing within particular things. And that's one of the major questions of classical philosophy. Second, so how do change and constancy coexist? How is it that there is change in the world, but also things remain the same at the same time? Think about yourself, right? Your own identity. Think about what you look like as an infant versus what you look like at 50 years old and what you act like. It was a question of how am I the same? Everything about you has changed. Your mental capacity has changed. Your experiences have changed. The way you look at the world has changed. Physically, you look nothing like you did when you were an infant, but you still recognize yourself as the same person. So how is it that there's so much change, but we have constancy underlying that change? Is everything change, or is everything just constant, or do those two realities somehow work together? The third question then is, what is the connection between things and ideas? And this is related to the first and second question, actually. And that is the question of, we have these particular things. So take the dog that I mentioned before, but I have this idea in my head of what a dog is. So how does the idea in my head that I have of dog relate to the individual particular thing? Because that's not an idea, that's a material object. But I still recognize it as having this universal form of dog, because I'm still identifying it as dog. So there are questions like, well, does that idea actually exist in reality, or is that just a human construct of the mind? And that there is nothing that actually unites those particular things together. And then we have the fourth question, which is the question of virtue, the question of ethics, which is how should I live in the world? So classical philosophy is very practical. And ultimately, all of classical philosophy is, and we're talking about the Platonic and Aristotelian forms. We have the sophists and other groups as well that don't do this, but ultimately, it's about the building up of character, the building up of a virtuous person and a virtuous society. So we have the question of individual virtue and the development of virtue, and then we have the question of social ethics or social virtue, with something like Plato's Republic, for example. So those are the primary questions that are going to guide the classical philosophers. So pretty much anyone that you look at, whether you're looking at Boethius or St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, they're all going to basically be guided by some of those fundamental questions in the way that they formulate their ideas.